Hi everyone, welcome to another lesson about Islamic history, early medieval Islamic history from the birth of Prophet Muhammad to around the year 1000 when a kind of full-time Islamic civilization came about. And today we're going to be speaking about Hadiths and the Hadith party, but in order to understand what it is that is going on, we have to cover some basics. In fact, we have to look at what in the world is a Hadith or a tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. So let's begin here. A Hadith, which has a plural as a Hadith, it literally means news or a report. Sometimes they're called khabar, the plural being akhbar. But really what we're talking about is these are sayings or actions of the Prophet Muhammad. So if we think about that all as a together, sometimes it's referred to as the Sunnah. Sunnah literally just means the tradition. And we can think of it as kind of the general deeds of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, why is any of this important? Because it ultimately will form the basis for Islamic law and for a new kind of way of being Muslim that starts emerging in the 700s and 800s during the period we're looking at. So let's just look at what hadith is, what it might be. It can really be about anything and everything that the Prophet Muhammad did. So for example, let's look at this one. It's very short. It just says, do not become angry. Don't be angry. But let's look at the whole story. It says Abu Huraira, who is a person who knew the Prophet Muhammad, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, said, a man said to the Prophet, advise me. The messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him, said, don't become angry. The man repeated his request and the Prophet said, don't become angry. Okay, very, very simple, basic idea here. But this is the type of material that's being collected. Some of it has longer messages, such as this one. You have a figure, Omar ibn al-Khattab, reports, the messenger of God, peace be and blessing be upon him, says, verily, deeds are only with intentions. Now this is important. He's saying intentions matter, essentially, more than what people do. Verily, every person will have only what they intended, so whoever immigrated to God and his messenger, that is, whoever went on the hijrah, then his immigration is for God and his messenger. Whoever immigrated to get something in this world, or to marry a woman, then his immigration is for whatever he immigrated for. The point being here is that your intentions matter, right? They change the nature of your action, both for better and for worse. So even if you do something good, if you do it with bad intentions, it doesn't count as much, and that should be taken into account. If you do something bad with good intentions, that should also be taken into account, etc. This can feed in, you can think about into many different possible scenarios, but this is one where there's a kind of stronger, more complex moral message. Then we have things like this. So we have, again, the narrator of the thing, Uqba ibn al-Harith, said that he married the daughter of Abu Ihab bin Aziz. Later on, a woman came to him and said, I have suckled Uqba, and the woman he married at my breast. Uqba said to her, neither did I know that you had suckled me, nor did you tell me. Then he rode to see the messenger of God in Medina and asked him about the matter. The messenger said, how can you keep her as a wife when it has been said she suckled from the same breast? Then Uqba divorced her and she married another man. Now you might think, what in the world is going on here? Why is this a problem? Well, it does show us, for example, this question of kinship. In this case, people who suckle at the same breast, who are milk brothers or sisters, are also considered a type of sibling. In this case, the problem is this guy has married a woman who he did not know basically drank the same breast milk as him, therefore making them brother and sister, therefore making their marriage a form of incest. It also tells you what to do in this case, in which case she divorced him, or he divorced her, and she ends up marrying someone else. So, even if they had been married without knowledge, then they still have to fix this issue. Okay, so these are just types of things that come up. Sometimes they're even more prosaic. like this one. We used to be happy on Fridays, for there was an old lady who used to pull out the beetroot and put it in a cook pot with some barley. When we had finished the prayer, we would visit her and she would present the dish before us. So we used to be happy on Fridays because of that, and we never used to take our meal or have a midday nap except after the Friday prayer. By God, that meal contained no fat. So now you might think, well, this also gives us a lot of information just about kind of what was some daily life like back then. But it could also think about, well, what did the Prophet actually enjoy? What were the companions of the Prophet Muhammad eating at that time? If you wanted maybe to emulate them or to return back to that time of the Prophet, this would be a good way of doing so. And so it gets even more, it can become even more, let's see, prosaic, I guess. They said the Prophet ate the meat of a shoulder by cutting the meat with his teeth, and then he got up and offered the prayer without performing the ablution anew. Now, this is a story about the Prophet Muhammad, but I guess there is a point here about how he's eating, and also whether this somehow changes his ritual purity. So this ablution is what Muslims have to do before they pray. They have to be in a state of ritual purity, so they wash their hands and feet. But he basically is saying that this doesn't counter your ablution, etc. So you can actually, as you can get a sense, this starts covering every aspect of life in many different ways. The Prophet's examples about the Prophet's life become the basis for all sorts of different traditions. Now, you might think, how do you actually know which of these traditions are reliable? So, for example, think about this hadith. The Messenger of God said eggplants are a cure for every illness. Is this really the case? Did the Prophet Muhammad really say this or not? And in fact, this is a common issue. By the way, this is a fake hadith. But this was a common issue back then, just as it is today. And so as people started collecting hadiths and kind of compiling them together, they started thinking, well, how do we know which ones are true and which ones are invented or misremembered or possibly, worse off, created for personal gain, such as the eggplant one might be from a guy who sells eggplants. Now, they had a few solutions to this. They started kind of creating a process of correcting and figuring out hadiths. They would basically start, when they would travel, these people who collected hadiths, the hadith party, these people that became obsessed with hadiths starting in the 700s, they started going around from town to town, different places, just trying to collect from different people stories about the Prophet Muhammad. Now, at this point, remember, it's been about 150 years, 100 years since, starting about between 100 and 200 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So there's been a few different chains of transmission, a few different generations through which these stories have been pressed. So they would go around and just collect them, and then they would memorize them, right? They wouldn't write them down, they would memorize them and keep them in their head, and then they would become kind of living encyclopedias of these hadiths. Now, when they were trying to figure out, well, how do we know that this hadith is correct, what they would look for is basically multiple chains of transmission. So if they can find the same story coming from two different witnesses, transmitted through, or one witness but then transmitted through two different chains, then there's more, or 3 or 4 different chains, and there's more likelihood that this is a true story. If they just find one chain and it's kind of spotty and it's not clear how exactly it got back to the Prophet Muhammad, maybe that's a more suspicious hadith. Then they look for logical inconsistencies. They try to figure out, for example, if he starts speaking about bananas or coffee, and there obviously wasn't any coffee at that time, then this is probably not a hadith that existed back then. It was invented. And the last thing that they do is they look at the moral condition of the transmitter. So if someone is known to be a liar, if someone even is known to be an adulterer, a murderer, have committed some crime, etc. That is a judgment on the moral character of the transmitter. And therefore, it also suggests that the hadith itself is unreliable. And now, to figure this out, they started also collecting not just hadiths, but also the biographies of these people. And then they wrote them down eventually in what are called tabakat, which means generations, but we can think of them as biographical dictionaries. They are like a type of writing that used to be around in the 20th century called Who's Who, basically a big dictionary of important people, giving you little biographies of them. And that's what they did as well. They would tell you who's this person, where were they born, where did they die, could they have been actually in the place to receive that transmission. And then overall, they give you some pieces about their life. And today they end up being major sources of data for historians. So let's look at one of these biographical dictionaries entries. This is from a figure, I just pulled this off the web, but we're looking at a guy named Sheikh Abu Ahmed Abdullah bin Adi. So his name is Abdullah, son of Adi. Abu Ahmed is his kunya, his another name that he's known for, and he's also sometimes known, so Abu Ahmed means father of Ahmed, sometimes also known as son of Adi ibn Adi. Okay, so we have the when he's born, when he's dead. Okay, someone's modern times have added how old he is, but then they give his name and they say he's better known as Sheikh Ibn Adi. Say Ibn Adi was an imam, a prayer leader, and a hadith master of his time who traveled the world to seek knowledge. He's the author of the book Al-Kamil fil Jarh wal Ta'dil, which is a great text consisting of 5 large volumes. And then it gives kind of when he was born, 277. He took hadith from scholars in 290. When he was 13 years old, first traveled for knowledge in 297. So when he was 20 years old, he starts traveling around collecting hadith. And then he gives you his teachers. And because he lived so long, he had very short chains of transmission that he was keeping. Basically, people, started collecting these chains of transmission. The shorter they were, the better they were, the more authentic. And he says he specialized in criticism of narrators of hadith and authentication of hadith and their chains, etc., etc. It keeps going on. Then it gives you some more information, other people's views of his book, what his book is about, and when he died. Now, if he had more than one book, they would give you more. Sometimes they actually give you lots of interesting details about their lives. But in this case, it's mostly focused on his life as a hadith transmitter. Now, let's look at a full hadith, where we have both of these aspects. So a full hadith basically has 2 parts. It has this isnad, and it has the matan. The matan means text. The isnad means the kind of genealogy of it. Okay, so we have the guy who's collected the hadith, al-Bukhari, reported that. Now he's going to give his chain. He has Yahya ibn Bukair narrated to us from Al-Layth, from Uqayl, from Ibn Shu'bah, from Arwa, from Aisha. Aisha was the youngest wife of the Prophet Muhammad, who said, whenever the Prophet was given an option between 2 things, he used to select the easier of the 2 as long as it was not sinful. But if it was sinful, he would remain far from it. Okay, so it'll give us some ideas about how to make decisions, whether we should opt for harder or easier choices. But the more important point here is that each of these parts, the isnad and the matan, are equally important, right? You need to know where it came from. In this case, initially came from his wife, and then was passed down through 4 generations, 5 generations of narrations until al-Bukhari recorded it. Now, what they ultimately did, these hadith collectors and narrators, is that they started creating basically a rating system. If a hadith was considered trustworthy, authentic, had multiple chains of transmission, etc., it was considered sahih. Sahih means trustworthy, authentic. It doesn't mean overall, 5 stars out of 5. And then if maybe there was just some small quibbles, etc., it would give 4 stars, basically give Hasan, good. But then there's different varieties, more problematic ones, sometimes called da'if, which are weak. And now there's varieties within that. There's fabricated hadith, ma'tu'a, there's munkar, there's ones that have been denounced as false, there's ones that are muttarib, shaky. So to give you an example of a fake hadith is one is this eggplants are a cure for every illness. In this case, they've figured out that this is not a real hadith. And in fact, they basically kept collections of fake hadith as well, that way to form a basis so that they know which ones are fake in the future. But we might ask, well, why did they keep, other than, for controlling the number, to differentiate fakes from real ones, is there any benefit to fake hadiths or false hadiths? And in fact, one of the interesting things that we find out is that false hadiths continue to be used. Sometimes they just embody a general sense of knowledge, and in fact, they continue to, often we'll find out, is that some hadiths, because they've spread so wide, because they circulate so far, and are useful, end up being adopted as basically useful and somewhat true, even if they're false. So this is, for example, one of those where it says, seek knowledge even if you have to go to China. This is a very famous hadith, championing the idea that you should pursue knowledge no matter what. This was used by the president of Malaysia a few years ago, and was constantly used, especially in modern times, when they wanted to kind of show that Muslims were part of this new scientific world, etc., and that early Islam was interested in science. So this was this kind of idea, one of the hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad that was used. But if you look at the different collections, you basically get a whole bunch of judgments against it, right? So Bayhaqi says its text is famous, it's a weak hadith, it's been narrated by chains which are entirely weak. And here it says Abu Tiq al-Tarif ibn Salman, he is rejected in hadith to the utmost, right? So it has, one of the transmitters is a bad guy, not reliable. And Ibn al-Jawzi says it's not authentic. Al-Dhahabi says, right, has this Abu Tiq Tarif ibn Salman in it. Other person says it's weak, another person says Al-Ba'ani says it's fabricated. So everyone agrees that this is just not a real hadith, but it continued to spread and be used, and from whenever it was invented, probably a few centuries after the death of Prophet Muhammad, until later on. And that's because it kind of embodied an idea that was useful and interesting to people. And in fact, there are arguments that you can use hadiths even if it's only because they've become so common and developed. One thing to keep in mind, remember, as we saw here, is that this moral probity of the transmitters is one of the most important parts of developing hadith. And we might want to think about the fact, is morality still actually important in the production of knowledge today? Do we care about the moral stature of scientists? Do scientists have to be, or scholars have to be, moral beings? Do you care about my personal life when you read research or when you learn about the material here, or not? Would it matter to you? But you might say maybe not, maybe there is in the end a real form of science. But let me give you one last example. If a professor is accused of sexual harassment, some people argue that his research, and I'll just use the he here to be clear, should not be cited. But is this proper? What do you think? Should you not cite people who have been accused or convicted of sexual harassment? I think sometimes that morality aspect is not so absent from our times as we might think. Now, this sexual harassment question was very relevant a few years ago and is still relevant today. We might also think about people who have been found to use AI once to, write research papers or articles. Does that mean that in the future we won't be able to, if they've been found to have done that, and publicly exposed to that, does that mean that you would never rely on them again? Some people would say yes, but this again shows different types of moral behaviors that are still important in the production of knowledge today.